Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're uncovering a fascinating and, honestly, deeply contradictory chapter of history. We're looking at the explosive expansion of the English Empire in the 1630s, which was a time when utopian dreams of religious freedom violently collided with some pretty grim economic realities.
This 1733 map by Henry Popple brilliantly captures a massive footprint stretching all the way from New England down to the Carolinas. In just a few decades, England went from a fragile, starving outpost in 1607 to this sprawling, contiguous empire. So how did they pull this off so fast? And more importantly, what kinds of societies were they actually building?
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll explore 1. The fragile empire expands, 2. Havens and heretics, 3. The Mid-Atlantic melting pot, 4. The Carolina plantations, and finally, 5. The Great Colonial Paradox.
Section 1. The fragile empire expands beyond 1607.
Growing significantly beyond those precarious beginnings in the Chesapeake, the 1630s saw an absolute explosion of new, distinct colonies. As populations expanded in places like Boston, ideological friction inevitably drove settlers apart. Maryland was granted in 1632. Then by 1636, Thomas Hooker led his congregation to establish Connecticut, while religious radicals founded Rhode Island. And in 1638, New Haven was born. The map was literally being redrawn in real time by this profound desire for spiritual autonomy.
Section 2. Havens and heretics. The search for autonomy.
This era was defined by severe friction. Take the Calvert family's vision, for instance. They wanted a staggering 12 million acre safe haven for persecuted English Catholics. But the reality? Well, most migrants were actually Protestant dissenters, and by 1650, they revolted and banned both Catholicism and Anglicanism. The very intolerance Calvert tried to escape ended up swallowing his utopian vision whole.
Now, you simply cannot understand early colonial dissent without knowing the word conventicles. Think of them as radical, underground study groups that operated completely outside official church structures. To the established clergymen, these weren't just innocent book clubs. They were dangerous, direct threats to the colony's political and spiritual survival.
Figures like Anne Hutchinson, who led these conventicles, really paid the price. She was expelled for heresy and pushed out of Massachusetts, settling near Providence in 1637. Rhode Island emerged as this incredible egalitarian haven. Founders like Roger Williams didn't just claim land, they actively negotiated with native leaders, like the Narragansett Sachems, to establish a space defined by true religious freedom, a refuge that eventually welcomed Quakers, Jews, and other persecuted groups.
Section 3. The Mid-Atlantic melting pot. Diverse new colonies.
Moving south from New England's rigid religious debates, the Mid-Atlantic boasted a healthier climate and highly navigable rivers. And the face of this region's final proprietary colony was William Penn. Penn was a Quaker, which was a radical group facing intense persecution back in England. Repaying a debt to Penn's father, the king granted him 45,000 square miles. Penn used this to enact a constitution of religious toleration and, driven by nonviolence, he actually purchased land from Native Americans rather than taking it by force.
His approach worked remarkably well. In 1685, Penn described his colony as a collection of diverse nations in Europe, including French, Dutch, Germans, Swedes, Danes, Finns, Scotch, and English. Pennsylvania quickly became a deeply diverse European melting pot. The takeaway here is really just simple economics and human nature. When you combine freedom of conscience with cheap land, representative government, and high wages, you create an irresistible magnet for people from all across Europe.
Section 4. The Carolina plantations. A different experiment.
Further down the coast, a completely different society was taking shape. In 1663, King Charles II granted Carolina to 8 lords proprietors who offered massive land incentives to attract settlers. But the real economic shift happened in 1670, when wealthy migrants arrived from Barbados to found Charlestown. They brought a deeply entrenched commercial agricultural framework with them, heavily integrating African, Native, and Latin American farming knowledge to cultivate highly lucrative crops like rice and indigo.
As we look at these thriving religious utopias in the north, the melting pots in the mid-Atlantic, and the booming plantations in the south, a massive question hangs over all of it. Who is actually powering this rapid growth? Where was the sheer volume of labor coming from to clear the forests, build the cities, and harvest the crops?
Section 5. The Great Colonial Paradox. The reality of slavery.
The undeniable, haunting reality of this era is that this massive expansion was inextricably linked to captive African labor. Thanks to the highly labor-intensive expansion of rice production, by the 1710s, South Carolina became the very first province in North America to have a majority black population. The entire economy was utterly dependent on African knowledge and enslaved labor. But it's important to shatter a common misconception here. Slavery was not just a Southern plantation phenomenon. Enslaved people actually made up between 10 and 20% of the rapidly growing urban populations in places like Philadelphia and New York City. They built ships, worked in urban workshops, and ran homes. Even though wheat grown by free farmers in the Delaware and Hudson Valleys was primarily sold to feed the enslaved workforce in the West Indies, the entire colonial economy was deeply intertwined.
Even in Pennsylvania, where ideals of nonviolence were foundational, prominent figures like William Penn eagerly purchased enslaved people to meet labor demands. In 1684, the vessel Isabella arrived in Philadelphia with 150 captive Africans. But almost immediately, a distinct, radical minority pushed back. In 1688, Quakers in Germantown submitted the first formal anti-slavery petition in America. Just 5 years later, George Keith published the first printed anti-slavery tract in English America, cautioning his fellow friends against buying or keeping humans as property.
As you reflect on the foundations of these colonies, I really want you to consider this profound, unresolved paradox. You have thousands risking everything, crossing an ocean in a radical pursuit of religious and political freedom. Yet, to sustain their success, they tethered their new societies to the brutal economic engine of slavery. How did they reconcile this? It's a contradiction woven into the very fabric of early America, a paradox that would go on to shape the entire future of the continent. Thanks for joining this explainer, and keep questioning the history you think you know.